Warning: this story contains themes of grief, disappearance, and unsettling mystery. The year was 1998. The disappearance of the Carver twins, a boy and a girl just 7 years old, from their backyard in a quiet suburban neighborhood became the kind of cold case that clung to a town like a shroud. Everyone in Oakhaven assumed it was a tragic accident, perhaps a fall into the old creek bed, their small bodies lost to the currents. Until a cryptic note arrived 20 years later, addressed to the surviving twin, tucked inside a familiar music box left on their porch. "He wasn't lost," the note read, the words chillingly simple. "He was taken. Find the place where the two meet." This wasn't an accident. It was the start of a terrifying search for a truth buried for decades. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe if you believe bullies always get what they deserve. For young Alara, home was less a sanctuary and more a museum of sorrow. Each object a relic of a life interrupted, a shadow that lingered just out of sight. The missing twin wasn't merely absent, he was a constant, suffocating presence, woven into the fabric of their days like a mournful thread. The silence where laughter should have been, the empty chair at the dinner table, the room across the hall preserved like a tomb. These were the mundane landscapes of Alara's childhood, steeped in the unspoken grief of her parents. Their love for her was a fragile, strained thing, filtered through the lens of their profound loss, their smiles rarely reaching their eyes. It felt as if they were perpetually holding their breath, waiting for a return that never came, a hope so thin it was agony. The weight of their shared tragedy bore down on Alara, shaping her into a quiet, observant child who navigated their home's heavy atmosphere with a practiced caution. Every year, the ritual arrived like a somber anniversary, her birthday. But it wasn't just hers. A single, unwavering candle was placed on her cake, sometimes on a separate, smaller cake, always with 2 numbers, one for her age, one for the age her brother would have been. Her parents watched, their faces etched with a familiar, aching pain, as Alara stared at the solitary flame, its light flickering and dancing in the dim dining room. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken wishes and mournful memories. It was the climactic moment of the year, the point where the veil between presence and absence felt thinnest. Alara would close her eyes, picturing the brother she knew only from faded photographs and whispered fragments of memory, offering up a wish so fervent it made her chest ache, a childish plea for him to be found, to come home, to fill the gaping hole in their lives. The air grew heavy with the combined weight of their silent hopes and crushing despair. Then, with a deep breath, she would blow out the single flame, a small puff of air extinguishing the tiny beacon, leaving only the lingering smell of burnt wax and the persistent, chilling darkness where her brother ought to have been, a darkness that seemed to hide secrets deeper than simple loss. The house held a stillness that wasn't empty but heavy, layered with the echoes of a life that never was. Through adolescence, the protagonist walked its familiar halls, each creak of the floorboards underfoot a quiet reminder that someone else should have been here, sharing the steps. They became adept at reading the subtle shifts in their parents' faces, the faraway look in their mother's eyes when a sibling was mentioned on television, the tight set of their father's jaw on certain anniversaries marked only by silence. The narrative of the vanished twin wasn't a story told aloud often, but it was woven into the fabric of their existence, a ghost thread pulled taut through every family gathering, every milestone celebrated alone. This quiet, constant presence molded them. They internalized the grief not as a sudden blow, but as a persistent ache, a limb missing that they'd never known. Being the surviving twin felt less like an identity chosen and more like a burden inherited, a role they had to perform in the silent play of the family's loss. They would sometimes stand before the scratched mirror in the hallway, tracing their own features, searching for resemblances to a face they could only imagine, pieced together from fragmented descriptions and a faded ultrasound photo tucked away in a drawer. A profound, unbidden connection bloomed in the quiet corners of their heart, a fierce protectiveness, a deep yearning, and a gnawing guilt that they had been granted breath while the other had not. This complex tapestry of emotions colored their psychology, making them introspective, empathetic to a fault, and carrying a quiet sorrow others couldn't name. Their relationship with their parents became a careful dance around the unspoken, a shared understanding of a central absence that bonded them yet also created distance, each locked in their own chamber of grief. One rainy afternoon, huddled in the attic, surrounded by boxes of forgotten things, they found a small, hand-stitched blanket never used. The soft wool felt cool against their cheek, and a wave of overwhelming tenderness, sorrow, and frustration washed over them. A silent scream trapped in their chest for the sister they mourned daily but had never met. The weight of that moment settled deep within, cementing the surviving twin label not just as a family narrative, but as the core of their own unfolding story. College life in the city was a roaring, chaotic symphony utterly unlike the hushed, careful silence of the small town where he grew up. Here, surrounded by 1,000 strangers with their own loud histories and uncensored opinions, questions he'd tucked away for years began to uncurl in the quiet corners of his mind. It started with casual conversations, classmates talking about siblings lost to illness or accidents, their grief raw, but their stories detailed, full of shared memories and confirmed facts. His own twin's disappearance, the one the family simply referred to as the incident, felt increasingly vague, wrapped in a narrative spun by his parents that felt less like recounting and more like reciting. They just went, his mother would sigh, tracing the rim of her teacup. They ran away, didn't want to be found, his father would add, his jaw tight. But runaways usually left notes, clues, a breadcrumb trail of intent. There had been nothing, just an empty house, a silent phone line, and 2 beds that stayed perfectly made. He remembered a crisp autumn day, years ago, shortly after it happened, finding a crumpled drawing beneath his twin's pillow, a map, childishly rendered, but clearly depicting their favorite secret spot by the creek. He'd shown it to his parents, hope flickering in his small chest, but his father had simply taken it, a weary look in his eyes, and later he saw it burning in the fireplace. "Just imagination," his mother had murmured, her voice strained. Now, the memory felt like a sharp stone in his gut. Why burn a child's drawing? Why the immediate, absolute certainty that they were simply gone? At work, sorting invoices in the echoing quiet of the office after hours, the silence amplified the questions. His parents talked about his twin with a curated, melancholic fondness, but any attempt to probe deeper, to ask about the days leading up to it, was met with averted eyes, sudden subject changes, a palpable wall of practiced avoidance. A knot of unease tightened in his chest. It wasn't just grief he saw in their faces. It was something else, fear perhaps, or maybe just an exhausting determination to keep the story contained. He looked out the tall, streaked window at the city lights, a million tiny points of revealed truth, and a different, unsettling thought bloomed. What if their story isn't the truth at all? The thought felt disloyal, a betrayal of the family peace, yet it pulsed with a strange, undeniable energy, urging him to look closer. The unsettling quiet after the truth began to unravel, settled deep in their bones, a constant low hum beneath the surface of everyday life. A new kind of hunger gnawed at them, not for food or rest, but for solid ground, for facts that didn't shift like mist. The initial impulse was simple, almost mundane, just wanting a clearer picture, perhaps some medical history, a firmer branch on the family tree. They started where logic dictated, the local library's genealogy section, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams, slicing through tall windows. Fingers traced lines in brittle ledgers, heads bent over microfilm readers, eyes scanning names and dates that offered nothing but frustrating blanks where connections should have been. Online forums felt colder, screens casting a pale, sterile light that did little to illuminate the shadows of the past. Typed questions hung unanswered, digital trails vanishing into the vast, indifferent landscape of the internet. A hesitant call to a distant relative, a voice thin and strained on the other end of the line, yielded only mumbled noncommittals and a quick farewell. "We don't talk about that," was the chilling, definitive end to that fragile thread. Each dead end wasn't just a failure of information. It was a fresh wave of isolation, reinforcing the terrifying feeling of being unmoored. Tension coiled tighter in their chest with every fruitless search. The mild curiosity had morphed into a desperate need, an aching compulsion. It wasn't about filling in gaps anymore. It was about fundamental identity, about understanding the very foundation beneath their feet, which now felt like crumbling earth. They sat hunched over the glowing screen late one night, the blue light reflecting in tired eyes, the click of the mouse a lonely sound in the silent room. Traditional avenues were exhausted, sealed off by time, distance, or deliberate silence. What else could there be? The thought pulsed, urgent and heavy. Then, like a sudden flash of lightning in a dark sky, the idea solidified, raw and terrifyingly simple. A DNA test. It felt drastic, a leap into the unknown, potentially stripping away the last vestiges of comfortable uncertainty. But it was the only path left that promised a chance, however slim, of finding the undeniable truth buried beneath the layers of silence and mystery. The decision was made in that quiet, tense moment, the weight of it settling heavily, marking the point of no return. The arrival of the small, unassuming box felt less like mail and more like the unearthing of a buried truth. Inside, nestled in sterile packaging, lay the DNA kit, a simple swab and a plastic tube, holding the potential to rewrite history. A knot tightened in her stomach as her fingers traced the smooth surface of the plastic. This tiny instrument held the power to connect her, definitively, to a past she simultaneously craved and dreaded. Hope, a fragile bird, fluttered in her chest, whispering possibilities of belonging, of finding a missing piece of herself. But anxiety was a lead weight, dragging her down with the chilling fear of what darkness the test might reveal, what horrors lay hidden beneath layers of time and secrecy. What if it confirms the worst? What if it leads nowhere? Her hands trembled slightly as she followed the instructions, the sterile cotton tip feeling alien against the inside of her cheek. It was a strange, intimate act, surrendering a part of her very being to a laboratory she'd never see, trusting strangers with her deepest fears and faintest hopes. Sealing the small biohazard bag felt final, irreversible, like closing a door on one path and stepping onto another, shrouded in mist. She walked the short distance to the mailbox, the heavy envelope a burden in her hand, the red flag on the box a stark signal in the afternoon sun. The clank, as it dropped inside, echoed disproportionately loud in the quiet street, a sound that sealed her fate to the hands of the Postal Service and the unseen scientists beyond. Then came the wait. Days bled into weeks, each morning a fresh wave of anticipation and disappointment, as her inbox remained stubbornly silent, her phone a dead weight. Every notification sent a jolt through her, only to dissipate into weary frustration. She found herself staring out windows, lost in thought, replaying fragmented memories, trying to conjure faces that might or might not be connected to the sample now traveling across the country. Once, she caught her reflection in the dark screen of her phone while checking for updates, her face a mask of raw vulnerability, the hope in her eyes battling the shadow of profound fear. The silence was deafening, amplifying the internal questions until they screamed. Was this the moment everything changed, or just another dead end? The system tracker still showed processing, a single, stagnant word that held her suspended between worlds. But soon, that status would shift. The digital silence would break, and the truth, whatever its shape, would finally arrive, demanding to be seen. He stared at the screen, the sterile white background of the email client a cruel contrast to the vibrant chaos that suddenly erupted inside his skull. The subject line, DNA results, case number, had seemed innocent enough moments ago, just another notification in a day filled with digital noise. He sat at the small kitchen table, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a mundane tableau that was about to be shattered. His finger, hesitant, tapped the attachment. A PDF loaded, slow and deliberate, each pixel a heavy weight settling in his chest. The technical jargon blurred, his eyes scanning, searching for the summary, the conclusion. Then he saw it. A single sentence, stark and definitive, stood out like a rogue wave in calm waters. Conclusion: paternity exclusion. The world tilted. Paternity exclusion? The words didn't compute, didn't fit. They were foreign invaders in the architecture of his reality. His breath hitched, a sharp, painful gasp that snagged in his throat. He read it again. Exclusion. It meant the man he had called Dad for 18 years, the man whose laugh echoed in his fondest memories, whose steady hand had taught him to ride a bike, whose worried frown had greeted him after late nights. Wasn't his father. Shock hit first, a physical blow that stole the air from his lungs. His hands, resting on the worn surface of the table, began to tremble violently. The coffee mug beside the laptop rattled softly. He looked around the kitchen, the familiar cupboards, the chipped paint on the wall, the framed family photo on the counter. None of it made sense anymore. Everything felt alien, disconnected. Disbelief flooded in, a thick, suffocating tide. This couldn't be right. There had to be a mistake, a lab error, a mix-up. His mind scrabbled for explanations, any explanation that didn't involve the fundamental lie he had lived. Confusion swirled, a dizzying vortex of memories and conflicting emotions. Was every moment, every shared glance, every hug a performance? Had he been living a carefully constructed fantasy? His thoughts snagged on small details, a shared look that felt so genuine, a piece of advice offered with such paternal care. How could it all be false? Numbness began to creep in at the edges of his awareness, a protective shroud attempting to dampen the overwhelming inferno of betrayal and loss. His focus narrowed to the single sentence on the screen, the words pulsing with a cold, brutal truth that negated nearly 2 decades of lived experience. The hum of the refrigerator in the corner seemed deafening, the only sound in the universe as his mind wrestled with the impossible. The framed family photo on the counter caught his eye. The smiling faces of the three of them frozen in time. A painful, mocking image of a life he now knew was built on sand. His gaze drifted to the door leading out of the kitchen, towards the rest of the house, towards the unknown truth waiting just beyond the frame. The blood roared in their ears, a sound louder than any spoken word. The air in the hallway, moments ago just air, now tasted of ash and betrayal. The revelation wasn't a gentle unfolding. It was a detonation, tearing the world the protagonist knew into jagged fragments. Twins. The word, the very foundation of their identity, now felt like a cruel, hollow echo. Grief wasn't for a death, but for a life that never breathed, a bond that never existed. A shared history meticulously fabricated, every memory, every shared glance recounted by parents, every birthday celebrated for two, warped into a grotesque pantomime. The toys in the corner, the slightly mismatched bedroom, evidence not of shared existence, but of a meticulously crafted lie. Their home, once a sanctuary humming with familiar comfort, transformed into a stage under harsh, unforgiving lights. The walls seemed to sneer. The furniture felt like props in a long-running play, starring naive victims and calculating deceivers. A crushing weight pressed down, not just the loss of a phantom sibling, but the monumental betrayal by the two people meant to protect them, to tell them the truth. The quiet, steady pulse of the house now felt like a ticking clock, counting down to something inevitable. How could they? How could they? The thoughts screamed internally, a raw wound bleeding into their consciousness. There was no going back, no unhearing the truth. A cold, sharp resolve began to crystallize amidst the chaos. They had to know why. They had to look their parents in the eye and demand answers for this shattered reality. Their gaze drifted towards the living room, where the architects of this elaborate fiction likely waited, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken accusations and the terrifying proximity of confrontation. The air in the living room was thick, heavy with the weight of years of silence. The familiar scent of old wood and polished furniture, once comforting, now felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. He stood by the fireplace, the mantelpiece cluttered with smiling family photos that mocked the moment. His hands clenched tight enough to ache. His parents sat opposite him on the sofa, rigid, their faces carefully blank, eyes flicking nervously towards each other, then away. This room, the stage for countless mundane evenings and holiday gatherings, was now a tribunal. He could hear the frantic beating of his own heart over the distant hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the tension like a knife. "I know about everything." Silence stretched, taut and agonizing. His mother's hands twisted in her lap, a frantic, silent motion. His father stared fixedly at a spot on the carpet, his jaw tight. Then, denial, soft and immediate. A reflex. "Know about what, dear? Is something wrong?" his mother asked, her voice thin, too high. It wasn't a question. It was a desperate plea for him to back down, to retreat into the comfortable lie. Pain flared hot and sharp in his chest, quickly followed by a cold, hard anger. "Don't," he warned, his voice stronger now, resonant with betrayal. "Don't lie to me, not anymore. I found out, about that night, about where you were, about who wasn't there." He watched them flinch, a subtle collapse of their carefully constructed facade. His father finally lifted his head, his eyes haunted, a flicker of something unreadable. Fear, guilt, passing through them. It wasn't how you think, his father mumbled, evasion taking the place of outright denial. A partial truth, a crack in the dam, allowing just a trickle of the terrible reality to seep through. The room seemed to tilt, the photos on the mantelpiece blurred. This wasn't just a secret, it was a fundamental fracture, placing a chasm between him and the two people who were supposed to be his foundation. They had hidden it, protected it, prioritized it over him, over the truth. The confrontation had begun, and the quiet desperation in their eyes promised that the initial crack was just the start of a much larger collapse. He needed to know everything, no matter how much it hurt. Dust motes danced in the one shaft of sunlight piercing the heavy living room curtains, illuminating the charged air between them. Alara sat rigid on the worn sofa, the silence thicker than the dust she saw settling on her parents' familiar, now alien faces. Her hands clenched tight enough to ache, her knuckles white. This room, this house, had been the fortress of her childhood, built on a foundation of lies she hadn't known existed until days ago. Now, the walls felt thin, ready to crumble. Why? The single word torn from her throat sounded alien in the quiet. Why did you tell me he was dead? Her mother wrung her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floorboards as if answers were etched there. Her father stared out the window, his shoulders slumped, a silhouette against the weak light. The air vibrated with unspoken fears, years of calculated silence finally demanding their toll. Alara felt a chilling empathy for the trap they'd built for themselves, even as it had trapped her too. She needed to understand the twisted logic that could justify such a sustained deception. We thought. Her mother's voice was a fragile whisper. We thought it was for the best, to protect you. Protect her? From what? From him? Alara's mind reeled. The image of the stranger's face, the one she'd seen in the fleeting moment at the gate, the face that mirrored her own in an impossible way, flashed behind her eyes. Protect me by making me believe my brother didn't exist? She pushed herself up, pacing the small space before the fireplace, her movements sharp and restless. Every birthday, every holiday, every empty chair, that was protection. Her father turned then, his eyes holding a deep, weary pain that Alara had never seen before. Things were complicated, Alara, dangerous. His voice was rough, like scraping stone. There were people looking for him. We had to make him disappear, make it seem like a tragedy no one would question. It was the only way to keep him safe, to keep us safe. Dangerous people. The words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Who were these people? And how did they connect to a boy who was supposedly just a child? A framed family photo on the mantelpiece, capturing a moment of perfect, manufactured happiness years ago, seemed to mock her now. Her gaze snagged on a small, tarnished silver locket peeking from beneath a pile of old letters on the side table, something she'd never noticed before. It seemed out of place, hinting at secrets still hidden in the open. If you see someone being disrespected like this, like and tell us in the comments what you would do. They said she vanished from the old oak tree. The words echoed, hollow and terrible, in his mind. Playing outside, by the tree, just like she always did. That was the story they had told everyone. That was the lie they had built their life around for years. He saw it now, sharp and clear. The hesitant tilt of his mother's head, the way his father's eyes avoided his own when they first explained it, their voices soft with rehearsed sorrow. It was a carefully constructed stage play, repeated until the whole town believed it. until he almost believed it too, burying the truth beneath layers of comforting fabrication. But the truth clawed its way up now, undeniable. He remembered that day with a brutal clarity that stole his breath. It wasn't sunny and bright by the oak tree. It was gray, drizzling, and his twin, his other half, hadn't been outside at all. He saw her vividly in his memory, small and flushed with fever, curled up in her bed with her worn sketchbook open, crayon clutched in her hand, drawing the wonky stars she loved. He had brought her a glass of water just an hour before the quiet fell over the house. She was weak, pale, definitely not well enough to be running around under the damp branches of the oak. She was inside. The simple, devastating fact hammered against his skull. He remembered finding the room later, unnaturally tidy, the sketchbook and crayons gone, the blankets smoothed back onto the bed as if no one had ever been there. Not vanished from a tree, but erased from a room. The specific details of their story, the exact time, the desperate calls they claimed to have made, the neighbors they supposedly alerted immediately, now felt like bricks in a wall, carefully placed, not to explain, but to conceal. It wasn't just a loss. It was a deliberate, intricate deception woven around the most sacred bond he knew. A wave of nausea rolled through him, hot and suffocating. They hadn't just lost her. They had stolen his memories of her, replacing them with a monstrous fairy tale. The cold dread settled deep in his gut, heavier than grief. What else had they lied about? What other truths lay buried beneath the surface of their quiet, sorrowful home? The world outside the window blurred into an indifferent smear of color. But inside, a storm raged, contained within the fragile cage of her ribs. The weight was physical, a crushing press on her chest, making each breath a conscious, painful effort. It wasn't just sorrow. It was a complex Gordian knot of agony, grief for the twin she had loved, shared secrets with, built dreams alongside. That person didn't exist, not truly, not in the way she believed. It was like mourning a ghost, the cruelest kind of bereavement. Then came the burning wave of anger, hot and bitter in her throat, directed at the two people who were supposed to be her anchors, her safe harbor. How could they? How could they build a lifetime on such a foundation of deceit? Every childhood memory, every shared glance, every scraped knee they had kissed better. It all felt tainted, a performance she had unwittingly starred in. Confusion was a constant hum beneath the other emotions, a dizzying disorientation. Who was she? If her entire identity was woven around this fabricated relationship, this shared history that was a lie, then who remained at the core? The loss of trust was the deepest wound, an emptiness where faith used to reside. She felt adrift, every familiar shore submerged by the rising tide of betrayal. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the unspoken lies that had defined her existence. Her hands trembled, not with cold, but with the sheer force of the psychological burden she now carried, the crushing knowledge that her reality was a carefully constructed illusion. She saw fleeting images, shared laughter by a lake, whispered fears under blankets, arguments over stolen toys that now seemed grotesque in their artificiality. Each memory was a sharp shard twisting in her gut. The silence around her screamed the truth, louder than any confession ever could. Her vision swam, focusing for a moment on the dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight, oblivious to the cataclysm inside. It was in that moment, choked with despair, that a different kind of heat ignited within her. Not anger, but a cold, sharp need. The need to understand, not just the what, but the why. The questions hammered against the inside of her skull, demanding answers, demanding a reckoning. This suffocating pain couldn't be the end. It had to lead somewhere, anywhere, away from this crippling stillness. She needed to uncover the truth, not just the one that had broken her, but the one that lay hidden beneath it all. She stepped into the small, quiet room, the air tasting faintly of chamomile tea and paper. A plush armchair beckoned, a stark contrast to the hard edges of home. Dr. Evelyn Reed sat opposite, her expression one of calm, steady attention. It felt alien, this space devoid of sharp words or watchful eyes. A knot tightened in her stomach. Articulating the chaos felt impossible, like trying to describe a hurricane while still inside it. She sank into the chair, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles ached. For a long moment, only the gentle hum of the air conditioning filled the silence. Could I even say it out loud? She began slowly, words stumbling over one another at first. She spoke of the shifting ground beneath her feet, the constant doubt that had become a second skin. Memories, fragmented and sharp, pricked at her consciousness as she spoke. A chillingly placid smile, a quiet threat disguised as concern. The suffocating weight of expectations that felt more like manipulation. It was like pulling threads from a tightly woven tapestry, each one revealing a painful pattern she had lived within but never truly seen until now. Dr. Reed listened, her gaze unwavering, occasionally nodding or jotting a note on a small pad. There was no judgment in those steady eyes, only a quiet invitation to continue. It was this simple, non-reactive presence that cracked something open inside her. She recounted a particularly vivid instance, a moment that had replayed in her mind countless times, always leaving her feeling confused and guilty. As she described, the chilling words spoken so casually, the way they twisted reality, a single tear tracked down her cheek, hot and unexpected. And I always wondered if I was crazy, she whispered, the confession feeling like a mountain shifting. Dr. Reed leaned forward slightly. It sounds like you were surviving in a very complex environment, she said softly. It's natural to question your own perception when the truth is constantly being redefined. The validation? Simple and calm, landed like a lifeline. It wasn't an accusation, it was understanding. The weight lifted, just a fraction, but enough to feel the possibility of air. She looked at her hands, still clasped, and slowly, deliberately, unclenched her fingers. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about finding the ground to stand on. But therapy alone felt like chipping away at a mountain with a spoon. She needed more than understanding. She needed proof. The air in the room hung thick and stale, heavy with unspoken accusations and years of carefully maintained silence. Eleanor traced the worn velvet pattern on the arm of the chair, the fabric rough beneath her fingertips. Justice. The word felt enormous, unwieldy, nothing like the neat definitions she'd learned in textbooks. Here, across the small, cluttered coffee table, from the people who had carved fissures deep inside her, justice wasn't a verdict handed down by a judge. It was something she had to invent, piece by painstaking piece, out of the wreckage. Her gaze flickered to the framed family photo on the mantel, a frozen moment of forced smiles from a time when the world felt deceptively simple. The memory of that day, the tight ache in her chest even then, was a sharp, nostalgic pang, a cruel reminder of the innocence she'd lost and the long, lonely path that had brought her here. Could justice truly be found in severing ties, simply walking away from the tangled mess of shared history? A part of her yearned for that clean break, the quiet freedom of distance. But another part, raw and bleeding, demanded accountability. Not just a muttered apology, which she knew would ring hollow, but a genuine reckoning with the truth of what had happened, the deliberate choices that had shaped her pain. She considered the sterile promise of legal action, the cold pursuit of emotional distress, but the thought felt empty. Could a courtroom truly measure the weight of a child's fear, the suffocating shame that had followed her for decades? No, her justice had to be personal, a reclaiming of the power that had been stripped away so brutally long ago. As a grandfather clock in the hall chimed its slow, sonorous protest, a single tear tracked a slow path down her cheek. The emotional climax wasn't in demanding anything from them, but in the quiet, internal certainty that bloomed within her. Her justice would be defined by her own healing, by the strength it took to look them in the eye and understand that their failure did not define her worth. She gripped the chair arm tighter, knuckles white. A silent promise hardening in her gut. This was just the beginning of setting the scales right, one painful, deliberate step at a time. The air in the sterile room felt thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and years of buried rot. It wasn't a courtroom, not officially, but the configuration of the long polished table, the row of solemn faces opposite them, and the solitary chair where the main character sat, felt like one, amplifying the weight of judgment. The parents sat side by side, small and pale under the fluorescent glare. Their usual bluster was gone, replaced by a brittle stillness that cracked around the edges every time a difficult question was posed. His mother twisted a thin gold ring on her finger, her eyes darting everywhere but at the faces across the table. His father stared fixedly at the wood grain, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The mediator's voice was calm, measured, yet each word fell like a stone into the silence, demanding accountability. He remembered a childhood afternoon, sitting on this same father's lap, listening to a made-up story about brave knights and wicked dragons. A memory that now felt like a cruel, misplaced joke. That nostalgic image collided violently with the reality of the man hunched there, exposed and hollow. A sharp intake of breath drew his gaze back. A binder of compiled statements lay open, detailing their actions, their inactions, their calculated silence. The emotional climax hit when the mediator read a passage aloud, a chillingly detached line from one of the victim's statements, describing the very night everything changed. A description that echoed the sounds he himself had tried to forget. The distant shouts, the abrupt silence, the crushing fear. His mother made a small, wounded sound, finally looking up, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting, agonizing second, filled with a complex mix of shame and defiance, before she looked away again. It was a cinematic detail, the way the light caught the tear tracing a path down her cheek. Even if they confessed, even if consequences were levied, the chasm that had opened between them could never be fully bridged. This wasn't closure. It was an excavation of pain, leaving raw earth exposed. The question hung in the air. What happens to a family unit when its foundation is revealed to be built on such devastating lies? The scent of lemon polish and old wood filled the air, a clean, unfamiliar smell that felt like a thin, fragile shield against the world outside. Alara traced the grain of the small kitchen table, her fingers catching on a tiny imperfection. This new apartment, sparse but sunlit, was one of the scaffolding pieces of her rebuilding. Each morning, the simple act of boiling water for tea felt like a victory, a quiet rebellion against the stillness that had once claimed her. The therapist's office, another structured space in her fractured reality, smelled of lavender and quiet sighs. Dr. Ramirez spoke softly, guiding Alara through the dense fog of memory, helping her name the shapes of terror and the ghosts that lingered. "It wasn't your fault," Dr. Ramirez would say, her voice a steady current against the tide of Alara's internalized blame. It was in these sessions, raw with tears and hesitant whispers, that the first cracks appeared in the wall of self-condemnation. She started seeing herself not as a victim defined by what happened, but as someone who survived it, resilient like the stubborn weeds pushing through pavement. She tentatively reached out, a hesitant text to a distant cousin, a cautious acceptance of coffee with someone from a support group. Redefining trust was the hardest part, a slow, painstaking process of testing the waters, one shallow step at a time. She looked at her reflection, really looked for the first time in years, noticing the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of pain, yes, but also of having lived through it. A wave of unexpected hope washed over her, sharp and clear like cold water, promising a future she could build, stone by careful stone, rooted in the hard-won truth of her own worth. As she locked her new door, the click of the deadbolt sounded, not like a barrier, but a foundation upon which other things, perhaps even connections to others she had lost, might one day stand. She sat alone in the quiet room, the silence amplified by the echoes of shouted lies and whispered betrayals that had recently shattered her world. For weeks, the weight of her family's deception had pressed down, a physical ache in her chest, making the simple act of breathing feel like a monumental effort. She ran a hand over the cool wood of her desk, the grainy texture a small anchor in the storm inside her head. She had felt utterly singular in her pain, a pariah carrying a secret shame that wasn't hers, convinced no one could possibly grasp the surreal horror of those closest to you living a manufactured lie, especially one that ensnared her. But one night, scrolling aimlessly through the vast, impersonal landscape of the internet, a forum appeared, a small corner specifically for people who had survived similar betrayals by those they loved and trusted most. Hesitantly, her hand trembling slightly, she typed out a few anonymous lines, a fractured sketch of her story, just enough to see if anyone, anywhere, understood. The response was a trickle at first, then a steady stream. Messages of solidarity arrived, shared experiences poured in, words that felt like cool water on a burning wound. It wasn't just the validation, it was the sudden, profound realization that the very thing that had made her feel irrevocably broken could connect her to others who were also piecing themselves back together. A surge, unfamiliar but powerfully resonant, rose within her. It wasn't strength born of hardness, but of resilience, like a plant pushing through concrete towards the sun after a long darkness. She saw the confusion, the lingering pain in others' posts, mirroring her own past agony, and a new feeling solidified. Not pity, but a fierce desire to illuminate the path she was finding, to offer the understanding she had so desperately needed in the lonely depths of her shock. There was one message that felt like a punch to the gut. A woman named Sarah, whose brief, stark description of being lied to by her parents about a fundamental aspect of her own identity resonated so deeply it felt like reading her own soul laid bare. Reading Sarah's words, seeing the raw, exposed vulnerability in the pixelated text, something shifted irreversibly inside her. It was no longer just about her pain. It was about a collective need for truth, for healing, for holding abusers accountable, even when they were family. In that pivotal moment, bathed in the blue light of the screen, a silent vow formed, hardening her resolve. Her experience wasn't a wound to be hidden away in shame. It was a scar that proved survival, a map that could guide others out of the terrifying dark forest of deception. The fear of exposing her family, the last vestiges of ingrained loyalty, battling against the brutal clarity of the truth, finally fractured and crumbled under the weight of this newfound purpose. She wouldn't be silent anymore, and that decision felt like stepping onto a battlefield, bracing for the coming fight. Warning: this story contains disturbing content. For 22 years, the disappearance of a high school class in rural Oregon has been a ghost story whispered through the quiet valleys. A cold case filed away under presumed accident. Everyone assumed a flash flood swept their bus into the river, lost to the unforgiving rapids and the dense, concealing forest. Time had layered forgetfulness over grief, solidifying assumptions into truth, until a hiker, 22 years later, stumbled upon a rusted school bus deep in the woods, miles from any logical route. The state it was found in, the chilling contents within, and the signs etched into the surrounding trees immediately revealed evidence that proved this wasn't an accident. It was a ritual. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe if you believe bullies always get what they deserve. Years had stretched out, long and quiet, since the raw, burning truth had been unearthed, since the faces behind the masks were finally revealed and held accountable. For the protagonist, those years were a slow, deliberate climb out of the deep, crushing darkness that deception had built around her life. She hadn't found the neat, simple closure the world expected. No sudden surge of forgiveness that washed away the pain like rain on concrete. Instead, healing arrived like the tide, a gradual, patient process of ebb and flow. She had moved far away, trading the suffocating familiarity of the past for a small cottage bathed in sunlight, the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a constant, soothing presence in the air. She spent hours tending a small garden, feeling the cool soil between her fingers, the tangible reality of life growing under her care, a stark contrast to the invisible rot that had infected her youth. Justice in its formal sense had provided a framework, but true peace was an internal architecture she had to build herself, brick by painstaking brick. She learned to trust the quiet hum of her own instincts, a compass she hadn't known she possessed when trapped in a world of lies. The lessons were etched deep. Truth, even when painful, was the only solid ground. Family wasn't solely defined by blood, but by honesty and genuine care. And self-reliance was the strongest anchor in any storm. One quiet afternoon, watching sunlight stream through the leaves outside her window, casting dappled patterns on the worn wooden floor, a wave of something akin to peace washed over her. Not joy, not happiness, but a profound sense of okayness. It was the quiet contentment of a life built free from the suffocating weight of secrets, a life earned through resilience and the quiet, enduring strength of her own spirit. She had survived the lie, and in surviving, she had learned how to truly live, breath by conscious breath. Even after years of cultivating peace, a residue lingered, a faint echo of the trauma that had reshaped the world. It wasn't a screaming anguish anymore, but a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of daily life, a flicker of unease in large crowds, a tightening in the chest at unexpected noises, a quiet sadness that surfaced during moments of unguarded reflection. The emotions weren't extreme, but they were distributed widely, coloring the edges of joy with a hint of melancholy, making gratitude feel fragile yet precious. She felt a profound sense of relief for the present, a quiet thankfulness for the simple beauty she had found. Yet there was an undeniable sorrow for the innocence lost, the years stolen, the person she might have been if not for the lie. Sometimes a wave of inexplicable loneliness would wash over her, a ghost of the isolation she'd felt, even when surrounded by those she believed loved her. It was the understanding that some wounds, even healed, leave scars that remind you of the battle. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, she would stand by her window, looking out at the quiet woods. In the distance, a light would flicker on in a neighbor's home, a small beacon of ordinary life against the deepening twilight. It was a quiet reminder that even after darkness, light finds a way to return.